So this is part 11 of the AS and AE level Java series, and in this episode we are going to be looking at the if statement. All right, so without further ado, let's start by creating a main method, and inside of the main method, we want to declare two values. We want to declare of type string, so we want to declare a string called username, and we say it's user, and we also want to declare another one called admin name, which is of type which is the literal admin. Then what we are going to do next is we need to check if the current logged in user is either an admin or it's a regular user. So the way you can make that decision in Java is to make use of the if statement. So the if statement looks something like this. Yes, going to say if, then you open parentheses, right? So inside of the parentheses, what you're going to put in there is a Boolean expression. Basically, what you have inside of those brackets is something that evaluates to a Boolean true or false. So what we want to do is we want to check if the current user logged in is the admin or it's just a regular user. So what we can do now is we can now say username dot equals, then we want to check if it's the admin name. So if this evaluates to true, right, we simply want to system.out. So system.out.println. So what we want to print is that the current user is a regular user, maybe, right? So let's go ahead and run this code and see what happens. So you see that we do not get anything in the console, right? The reason why this is happening is that on line 7, remember we said that what the expression that you put within the parenthesis of an if statement, they should be a Boolean expression. So we do know that user, inside of username we have the value user, and inside of admin name we have the value admin. So basically these two strings, they are different. So it simply means that if this Boolean expression evaluates to false, we are not going to see this line. But let's actually go ahead and see, maybe if we change the argument here to username. Right, let's actually go ahead and run the code and see what happens. So if we run this, we are going to get this value which says the current user is a regular user, right? So basically this means that this Boolean expression evaluates to true. So if this is true, the code that is within the if statement is going to be executed. So that's how an if statement works. If true, then we want to do this. Otherwise, if it is false, nothing is going to happen, like we saw in the first example right here, right? So the key takeaway right here is that you can have an if statement, an independent if statement, right? You can have an if statement that doesn't have an else. But oftentimes you realize that you always want to handle an alternate solution. So if something is true, you want to do this. But what if it is false? Because we've seen that if it is false, we are not going to get anything down there in the console, right? So sometimes we might actually need our program to be more descriptive or to be more useful to the people who will be using the program. So what we can do now is we can then make use of an else statement, right, which is basically the alternate. So the else statement, what it does is simply going to handle the alternate. So what we can do is now say in the event that username is not equal to admin name, then we simply want to print out the current user is not a regular user, meaning to say that it is the admin. So let's go ahead and run the code, and you realize that we get the code that is within the else block, right? The current user is not a regular user, meaning to say the current user is what? Is an admin. So that's how an if else statement works. Then maybe what happens to you? What would you do in a situation whereby you have maybe three situations that you want to check? So the way you can go about it is to make use of an if else, an if then else if, then finally else. So maybe let's suppose that we wanted to check if the user is registered. So let's actually have another value called registered, and we will say not what, not registered. In the situation, in the scenario whereby the user is not within the system. So what you can do is instead of saying the current user, we'll remove this line of code, then we'll come here and say else if, right? So this is the alternate. We want to check if username dot equals then what we can do in this case now is we need to say admin name. Then right here we need to change this to user name. Then admin name. Then what we need to do is we simply need to system dot out and say the user is not a regular user. Basically we are simply saying that the user is an admin. Then ultimately we simply need to print something like this: the current user is not registered. Is not registered. We already have a note going on there. Alright, so that's just about it. So what I'm going to do now is let's just go ahead and run the code and see what happens. So let's run the code, and you realize that the current user is a regular user. So this is the reason why that line is, we are executing line number 9 is because this if statement, or the expression within the first if right here, it's evaluating if username is equal to username, and we know that this is true, so that's why we are getting this. So what if maybe we change the value of user? Maybe let's change this from, let's take admin and put it here. Then let's take username and put it here. Right, let's go ahead and run that code and let's see what we get. So you realize that it's saying the current user is not a regular user. So now it's now checking this expression, and it realizes that username is not the same as admin. So this evaluates to false. So it's going to ignore all the statements within the body of the if. So it's now coming down to the if to the else if statement, and it's now checking if username equals username, and this is going to be true. So it means now it's going to run this code that is within the else if block right here. So what if we now take is registered and put it right here? So now we are checking if username is the same as registered, right? So let's just run that code and see what happens. So you realize that it's now running the code that is inside of the else block right there at the end. So it's now going to say the current user is not registered, right? So basically what's happening is that it's checking this first expression right here, and this evaluates to a false. Then it checks the expression right here on the else if, and if this evaluates to a false, it now needs a default solution or a default condition whereby it's just going to tell us that none of the statements that it encountered initially are true. So it's going to run this. Basically this is what we call the default expression that's going to be run. So that's how an if else statement works. Again, it's important to know that you can have an if statement, right, and a couple of else if statements. So you can have maybe a lot really of else if statements going on there. There's really no limit to the number of else if statements, but whenever you now have an else if statements, you ultimately need to have an else statement at the very end. Is it something that's going to be the fallback condition in the event that all the other statements preceding the else turn out to be false, right? You always want to have that else statement. But then again, remember, in the very first in the beginning of this tutorial, we saw that we can have an if statement that is independent, right, that doesn't have an else if or an else, and it's still going to work. So that's actually something you need to take note of. Then maybe later on in later tutorials, I'm going to demonstrate the concept of nesting, that is having an if statement within an if statement. But I think for now, this will suffice to introduce you to the concept of decision making using an if statement. I think that's just about it for this tutorial. I'll see you in the next one.